turbocharger uses the energy in an engine's exhaust gases to produce compressed air, which it feeds back into the engine. By doing this, it plays a big part in enhancing the engine's performance and reliability. The Mitsubishi Heavy Industry large turbochargers, known as MET series, are widely used for 2-cycle and 4-cycle diesel engines and gas engines of 1,000 kilowatts and higher. MET 18 SRC, developed as a small turbocharger, has realized high reliability and efficiency to meet the need to apply the performance and reliability proved in large turbochargers. A MET turbocharger incorporates a silencer, a scroll, a gas casing, and a bearing pedestal. On the inside, it has high-speed rotating components such as a turbine rotor, a turbine wheel, and a compressor impeller. Maintaining high turbocharger performance at all times is very important to ensure high engine performance and reliability. This means it is essential to understand the structure of the turbocharger and to apply this knowledge in turbocharger maintenance. In this video, you will see how a MET 18 SRC turbocharger is disassembled, inspected, and reassembled. The internal parts of the turbocharger must be cleaned and inspected periodically, depending on the combustion condition, operating hours, and other attributes of the engine. Remove the nuts connecting the silencer and the scroll, beginning with the bottom side. Also, loosen the bolts that fasten the vibration stopper plate and remove the silencer. Store the removed silencer in a safe place so that it doesn't turn over. With a clearance gauge, measure the clearance between the air inlet casing and the impeller at 4 locations: top, bottom, right, and left. These data will be necessary during reassembly. If the gas inlet casing is removed from the engine, measure the clearance between the turbine wheel and the gas inlet casing at 4 locations: top, bottom, right, and left in the same manner. Attach the eye bolt to the threaded hole at the boss of the scroll and lift with a wire rope. Remove the air inlet casing. Draw out the casing by screwing the removed bolt slowly into the threaded hole at the flange of the casing. Remove the V-band to remove the scroll. If it is not removed easily, knock it out with a shockless hammer. The scroll is attached with a diffuser. When storing the scroll, secure it so it doesn't turn over or damage the diffuser vane. Remove the bearing pedestal attached with the rotor shaft from the engine leaving the gas inlet casing on the engine. Lift the bearing pedestal. Remove the 2 bolts that fasten the fitting table and the bearing pedestal. Next, loosen the nut to remove the stopper plate. Remove the bearing pedestal. The packing is between the bearing pedestal and the gas inlet casing. Put the bearing pedestal in a place easy to work on and support so that it does not incline. Next, measure the thrust clearance. These data will be needed for reassembly. If the thrust bearing is filled with lubricating oil, accurate measurement is not obtained. Turn the rotor shaft 10 times or more. Set the dial gauge on the end of the rotor shaft. The thrust clearance is the difference of the divisions on the dial gauge when the rotor shaft is pushed to the compressor side and to the turbine side alternately. Take at least 5 measurements and check that the values do not vary. Before removing the impeller, measure the distance from the end of the nut to the shaft end with a depth gauge. You will need this dimensional value for checking that the amount of tightening is correct after reassembly. Next, attach the dial gauge to the end of the rotor shaft. Manually turn the rotor shaft in reverse direction of the operation and measure the deflection with the dial gauge. These data will be needed for comparison during reassembly. Please check if the match marks of the impeller and the shaft nut align with each other. If they don't, take the record of the relative positions, that is, the circumferential movement of the shaft nut. While holding the turbine wheel, loosen the locking nut with a spanner. Remove the washer. Attach impeller removal fittings to the boss of the impeller using bolts. Slowly turn the handle and pull out the impeller. Carefully store the impeller, placing horizontally in a safe place. Remove the bolts and the oil thrower. If the oil thrower is not removed easily, lift off while screwing the bolts into the threaded hole of the oil thrower. Remove the sleeve. Remove the support. After removing the bolts, Screw the removed bolts into the threaded hole in the flange and lift off. The support is fitted with the compressor side thrust bearing. Next, remove the thrust collar. Protect the rotor shaft by winding thin tape around the tip of the thread part. Supporting the rotor shaft with your hand, slowly pull out the rotor shaft. Store the removed rotor shaft in a safe place. Remove the retaining bolts and washers of the labyrinth packing. Remove the labyrinth packing. When the labyrinth packing is removed, the turbine side journal bearing is seen. Slowly pull out the turbine side journal bearing by hand. The bearing is attached with a nozzle. Remove the nozzle. Screw the removed bolts into the threaded hole of the thrust bearing, and then remove the bearing. When the turbine side thrust bearing is removed, the compressor side journal bearing is seen. Slowly take out the compressor side journal bearing by hand. Disassembly of the MET 18 SRC is now complete. Store all the removed parts in a safe place and keep them clean. The turbochargers will degrade in performance attributable to abrasion or fouling of parts after long usage. These may be developed into failures if overlooked. In order to prevent the performance degradation and trouble, periodical inspection of parts is required. Now, remove the compressor side thrust bearing from the support. Use a hex key to remove the thrust bearing side hexagon socket head cap screw. To lift and remove the bearing, screw the same bolts into the threaded hole in the compressor side thrust bearing. If a thrust bearing becomes worn, the tapered part gets smaller and the ratio of the flat part to the tapered part gets bigger. To check the extent of wear, first put a thin, even layer of red ink on the thrust collar. Gently place the colored side of the thrust collar on the metal surface of the bearing. Gently turn the thrust collar in the rotating direction during the operation. Then, lift off the thrust collar and observe where red ink has been transferred to the thrust bearing. If the red paint contact check shows that the ratio of the lengths of the tapered land to the lengths of the flat land is 2:1, replace the thrust bearing with a new one. Replace also if it is assumed to reach the limit of use by the next inspection. For the details of standards that may or may not be used when judging tapered land comparison, please check the instruction manual at hand. If you have difficulty making an evaluation, it is advisable to replace the thrust bearing with a new one. If the metal surface of the thrust bearing is deeply scratched, has multiple scratches, has surface separation, or is cracked, replace the thrust bearing with a new one. Please inspect the turbine side thrust bearing in the same way. If you closely observe the rotor shaft, you will be able to see the sliding width relative to the journal bearings. These parts of the rotor shaft are the journals by which the rotor shaft is supported. Install the journal bearing on the removed rotor shaft. With this journal bearing sliding part, use a dial gauge to measure the clearance between the inner surface of the journal bearing and the rotor shaft with the upper side of the inner surface pressed against the shaft. Compare the measurement with the clearance standard table in the instruction manual. If the metal surface appears to have many scratches or to be deeply scratched, replace the bearing with a new one. Do not attach the dial gauge to the rotor shaft. If you did, the rotor shaft would get magnetized. A locking pin is attached to the journal bearing. Replace the journal bearing if this pin is worn by 2 mm or more in width or broken. Measure the outer diameters of the sliding parts. If the outer diameter of the sliding part is smaller than the adjacent outer diameter by 0.02 mm or more, please contact Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. We recommend that the impeller be inspected by means of dye-penetrant floor detection for the backside and entire blade of the impeller. If any defects are found, replace with a new impeller. In the event that the leading edges of the impeller blades are indented from collision with a foreign object, please note the location and size and contact Mitsubishi Heavy Industries for consultation. Cleaning should be performed with a soft object, such as a sponge, with surface dirt removed using kerosene or warm water. Do not use a wire brush or any similar hard object. To clean the turbine wheel, dip them in a container of warm water to remove the deposited carbon scale. After removal, clean the turbine wheel. After washing the turbine wheel, dry them thoroughly and coat them with rust-proof oil. In the event that the radial turbine blades are indented from collision with a foreign object, please consult with Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Like the turbine wheel, clean the nozzle after washing in warm water. After cleaning the nozzle, dry it thoroughly and coat it with rust-proof oil. Visually inspect the nozzle in a well-lit location for abnormalities. The air filter must be cleaned at least once every 2 months. Soak the filter for 2 to 3 hours in lukewarm water in which a neutralizing cleaning agent has been dissolved. Then, gently wash the filter by hand. After washing the filter, dry it thoroughly by placing in a shaded location that's well ventilated. If the filter is broken or torn, replace it with a new one. On the compressor side of the bearing pedestal, an inlet of the sealing air channel is provided. Check that there is no evidence of lubricant leakage into the sealing air channel. Also, confirm that the air comes out on the turbine side by feeding general service air into the channel. The procedure for reassembly is basically the reverse of that for disassembly. Before starting reassembly, you must thoroughly clean the rotor shaft, bearings, and other components, and make sure there is no foreign matter in the bearing pedestal. Also, replace all tongued washers, O-rings, gaskets, and other consumable parts with new ones. When installing the bearings and the rotor shaft, take off your work gloves and work with your bare hands. Take care not to allow foreign matter to contaminate the components. For reassembly, follow the disassembly steps in reverse. Install the compressor side journal bearing to the bearing pedestal. Install the turbine side thrust bearing. After installing the nozzle, install the turbine side journal bearing to the bearing pedestal. Install the packing and the labyrinth packing. Clean the rotor shaft and apply lubricating oil to the shaft sufficiently. Apply also the lubricating oil sufficiently to the journal bearing where the rotor shaft passes. Carefully and slowly insert the rotor shaft so that it does not damage the labyrinth packing fin. Coat the turbine side thrust bearing and the thrust collar with lubricating oil. Reassemble the thrust collar to the rotor shaft. Attach the support to the bearing pedestal with the compressor side thrust bearing attached. Reassemble the sleeve to align the match marks of the rotor shaft. Reassemble the compressor side oil thrower. After pushing the impeller by hand, attach the washer and screw in the locking nut. Lightly turn the spanner by hand and determine the place where the locking nut stops turning as the zero position of tightening. Put the temporary match mark of the locking nut using the match marks of the impeller and washer as a reference. Tighten the locking nut with a spanner to the match marks of the impeller and washer. Loosen the locking nut once and make sure that the match marks of the locking nut is at the initial zero position. After confirming that the match marks align, tighten with the spanner to the right position. If the locking nut turning angle varies, retighten and erase the old match marks and stamp new match marks. Measure the distance from the end of the nut to the shaft end with a caliper or a depth gauge. Compare with the values obtained before overhaul and confirm that it has been fastened securely. Lightly turn the rotor shaft in reverse direction of the operation. Confirm that it rotates smoothly and there is no contacting noise. Attach a dial gauge to the end of the rotor shaft and measure the deflection at the shaft end. If the deflection measures 0.05 millimeters or more, it is considered that foreign matter is included in the contact surfaces of the impeller, sleeve, thrust collar, or rotor shaft. In that case, remove the impeller again to check the contact surfaces. Now, measure the thrust clearance. Set a dial gauge on the end of the rotor shaft just as you did before disassembly. The thrust clearance is the difference between when the rotor shaft is pushed and when it is pulled. Check that the clearance is the same as it was before disassembly. Attach the bearing pedestal with the rotor to the gas inlet casing. Check the packing between the bearing pedestal and the gas inlet casing. Carefully assemble the scroll and the air inlet casing to the bearing pedestal so that they do not come in contact with the impeller. With the clearance gauge, measure the clearance between the air inlet casing and the impeller blade tips at 4 locations: top, bottom, right, and left. Check that the clearance conforms to the standard value. In the event that the gas inlet casing is removed from the engine, measure the clearance between the turbine wheel and the gas inlet casing at 4 locations, top, bottom, right, and left, and make sure that the clearance is within the standard. For details of clearance standards, please refer to the clearance table in the instruction manual at hand. Lastly, reassemble the silencer to the scroll. As you have seen, the MET 18 SRC turbocharger is designed so that people with a reasonable amount of experience can disassemble, inspect, and reassemble it. Nevertheless, the procedures include dangerous tasks such as hoisting heavy components. It is vital for people performing these procedures to have the skills and knowledge needed to work safely and for them to work under safety control. Reading the MET 18 SRC turbocharger instruction manual carefully and understanding its content will help you work safely. Using your knowledge of both engines and turbochargers, you will be able to play a role in ensuring safe voyages.